Mary O'Hara, Chapter 31. The alarm clock broke the early morning silence of the bunkhouse and jangled for 60 seconds. Before it stopped, Tim and Gus were sitting naked on the edge of their bunks, yawning and rubbing their heads. Gus reached for his clothes and began to draw them on, remembering as he did so that something unpleasant was ahead of him. It was a moment or two before it came to him, the shooting of Flicka. When he remembered, he dropped both hands on his knees and sat in silence. Nothing for it, it must be done. The filly might have been left to die of her own accord, but that was contrary to custom on the Goose Bar Ranch. In fact, contrary to custom anywhere. An animal that has no chance for life is put out of its misery. Besides, there were the boss's orders, and McLaughlin never amended an order once it was given. The Swede pulled on his socks and heavy shoes and canvas trousers, then went to the kitchen sink to wash. Tim was already hurrying out of the door on his way to the spring house to get the milking pails. Gus finished dressing, made the fire and laid the table for breakfast, thinking that when he had everything ready except frying the eggs and bacon and making the coffee, he'd go down to the calf pasture with the Winchester. It wouldn't take a minute. He had the gun with him there in the bunkhouse. It stood in the corner, still loaded. He'd be back before Tim had finished milking the cows and have plenty of time to make breakfast. Tim, meanwhile, had gone down to milk, and found the milk cows waiting for him, placid, chewing their cuds, surging through the gate the moment he opened it, in a hurry for their feed. It was just the usual bunch. The dry cows and the yearlings knew better than to be waiting at the gate, for they got no grain rations. Gus walked down to the ranch house, stood the gun against the house outside, and went into the kitchen to make up the fire. Gus's shaking down of the ashes every morning was the rising bell for the family. When the kindling had caught and the flames were licking up around the blocks of coal, Gus closed the back draft and went out. He took the gun and walked slowly across the green to the gate of the calf pasture. A few minutes' walk brought him to Flicka's nursery and showed him that Flicka was not there. He walked downstream and soon found Ken sitting in the water, Flicka's head in his arms. One look at the boy's face was enough. Gus crossed the creek, laid down his gun and, seizing the filly by the head, dragged her out onto the grassy bank. As doctors drag infants into the world by the head, never safely by any other part. Ken could not move. Gus lifted him in his arms and again crossed the creek. Ken's head dropped back over the Swede's shoulder, turning to the filly for one last look. "Goodbye, Flicka." It was only a whisper. Rob was standing at his window, fastening his belt, when he saw the foreman passing, carrying Ken. He thought, Flicka died. I didn't hear the Winchester. Ken's found her dead, fainted. He ran downstairs and out, took the boy from Gus's arms, and then noticed the unbelievably shrunken, drawn features and the violent chills. This was more than a faint. Gus told him how he had found Ken, and Rob carried him in and up to bed. Rob and Nell put Ken to bed between hot blankets and tried to get some brandy between his lips. Gus returned to the pasture to get the gun. Flicka was lying as he had left her, but at his approach held up her head. The man knelt down on the grass by her and felt her head, her neck, looked into her eyes. "Well, well, Flicka, little girl." He was astonished to feel that her body seemed to have lost its great heat. The fever had gone. He looked at the two wounds. The cuts were clean, and all the hard swelling had gone, and he could see by her face that she was brighter, as one can see by the expression in a child's face, even though it is still pinched and worn, that life is coming back. He stood up, slowly, the gun in his hand, and stood there hesitating. He had received his orders. He was to shoot Flicka sometime soon when Ken was not around. there would never be a better moment than right now. A minute or so passed, while the Swede stood looking down at the filly and pondering the situation. Then, straightening up, he put the Winchester in the crook of his left arm, raised his eyes to scan the sky and read the weather signs, and his hands automatically fumbled in his clothing for his pipe, tobacco, and matches. A few puffs of his pipe would help him to think this out. That the filly might actually recover was hardly likely. He wondered how long Ken had been holding her. There was no telling. They were all familiar with Ken's habits. He might have been there since dawn. The big foreman stood pensively, his blue eyes with the far look in them, which the eyes of plainsmen have, roving here and there, taking in the weather signs. There was no wind this morning. The sky was clouding over. If the wind did not come up, they'd have rain. Natural enough, the weather was due to break. In one of the 3 pine trees there were a dozen chattering magpies. They were flying up and down, circling around the tree, making a great racket. They've got something in that tree, or near it, thought the Swede. Rabbit? Gopher? His eyes moved on. He noticed the cattle, the yellow and white Guernseys, the yearling heifers and the dryer cows, grazing calmly, dotted here and there about the pasture. He noticed their condition. They seemed well fleshed. From there his eyes dropped to the grass. Plenty grass yet in the calf pasture. Grass was holding out well this year. He noticed the smoke coming out of the chimneys of the ranch house and the bunkhouse. That startled him out of his reverie. Time for him to finish making breakfast. Tim would be up from the milking soon. He found that his mind had made itself up while he stood there in a reverie. He would not shoot Flicka just yet. Perhaps by the time Ken had had his breakfast and got warmed up, he might have something to say that would change his father's mind. The man walked back up the little path and on to the bunkhouse. It's the end of chapter 31.